Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Other Universals Consortium virtual panel. The theme for today is on non-Western Marxism. And we will be having 3 speakers speaking today. My name is Luando Scott, and I come to you from Cape Town. It's a gloomy and rainy day today, although tomorrow is supposedly the first day of spring. I guess Mother Nature has quite a lot of jokes, eh? I'm based at the Center for Humanities Research, and I will be chairing today's meeting. And you'll be seeing more of me in future meetings as I will be representing the Center for Humanities Research in the Other Universals. So for today's program, we have 3 speakers, as I've shared. I will introduce each speaker as they're about to speak. They will have about 15 to 20 minutes each to speak. And then we will have a Q&A after all the speakers have spoken. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Aditya Nijam, who is a political theorist, formerly from the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi. He's the author of Decolonizing Theory, Thinking Across Traditions, and one of the books that was part of our reading group, Border Marxism and Historical Materialism. I will give it over to you, Professor Nijam, to present to us for about 15 to 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot to everybody, to the other Universals Consortium, and to you, Dr. Scott. To I can't possibly name everybody, but it's a great opportunity once again to be able to talk to you about. Primarily, I will be discussing through the points that I have raised in my recent book, which was mentioned by Dr. Scott, Border Marxisms and Historical Materialism. And I will actually begin by with a brief remark on this term, non-Western Marxisms, or the expression border Marxism, which I have used in my book as the title, in order to explain how we might understand these expressions, so that I want to dispel some generally very ill-informed kind of opinions which keep circulating around these kind of expressions, or which have non-West or global South in them. So let me illustrate this by drawing a comparison with Buddhism and Christianity very briefly. So Buddha, who was born in Nepal and then lived in India, and that was where his philosophy was born. And from there it traveled to Sri Lanka, Tibet, China, Japan, and various parts of Southeast Asia. We know that in this rapid spread across East and Southeast Asia, it went through many transformations. And in fact, would be almost impossible to distinguish between the Sri Lankan Theravada Buddhism and the Mahayana Buddhism that went to Tibet, China, Japan, and so on. In purely doctrinal terms, there's a lot of difference there. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that it was the monks and philosophers who actually made Buddhism their own, so that Buddhism became part of Chinese or Japanese or Tibetan soil or Tibetan culture. Similarly, Christianity, which was born in Palestine and then spread to become the central religion of Europe, is also a case of a similar kind, where at least in doctrinal terms we can say that the expansion of Christianity throughout Europe was, and it's intermingling, it's becoming actually a key component of European culture, would not have been possible only with the authority or the power of the church, had it not been for the scholastics and the thinkers and philosophers, theologians, who actually worked on the doctrinal aspects of the religion. So in a way, my comparison is also related then to my point about Western Marxism is also related then, and there's a similar kind of thing we would notice with respect to Western Marxism. And my concern in this book has been not with Marx, which I make very clear. It has not been with either a return to Marx, which a lot of people have been talking about, or the return of Marx, because my concern has been centrally with Marxism's, what we can call the earthly journey outside its land of birth, which is Western Europe, and where therefore the question is not of origins. Like Buddhism or Christianity, in Marxism's case also, we are not concerned about so much about the question of origins. The concern here is rather the transformations that took place, happened or did not happen in its long journey through the global south, which includes the revolutions of China and Vietnam, and even to a large extent the Russian Revolution. So after a large part of that is Asia, a large part of the Russian Empire was Asia. So my concerns here, therefore, are with these transformations, crucial to which were, let us say, concerns of national liberation, of what was theorized by the Pakistani scholar Hamza Alawi and the Lebanese Marxist Mahdi Amel as the colonial mode of production, issues of underdevelopment and dependency that became central to Marxist debates in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Crucial to the theorizations were also of passive revolution, which borrowed from Antonio Gramsci, especially in India, and the critiques of Eurocentrism that emerged from the later writings of Samir Amin. There are many other things one could say about the ways in which the concerns that diverged so substantially from the kind of concerns and practices that marked the body of Western Marxism. But there is also a very big difference in comparison with Buddhism and Christianity in that in many Asian and African countries, thanks to the endless inquisitions carried out by this Communist International, no such philosophical or intellectual attempts were allowed to develop in the non-Western world. Latin America remains a bit of an exception, where the influence of the Cuban Revolution and so on also made a very big difference. Indeed, Africa too has fared much better than Asia with its Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral, Albert Memmi, Aimé Césaire, and others, though one could argue that far more needs to be done than offer critiques, very powerful critiques, of colonialism and imperialism. In theoretical and philosophical terms, my attempt in this book has been to identify and grapple with two issues, philosophical issues. One, the problem of historical materialism's linear time, and the related question of so-called uneven development. Second, the problem of what I tentatively call the outside of capitalism and the related problem of the agency of the global south. Now, this question of the outside has itself been, I have only used it as a placeholder in the beginning of the book. By the time we reach the latter part of the book, if you get the opportunity to read it, you'll see that I actually dispense with the term. It is only from this recognition that I undertake a very detailed engagement with the ideas of Ideas and Political Thought of Mao Zedong in the introductory chapter of the book. For many of us who were growing up as young student radicals in the 1970s in India, the appeal of Mao was instinctive. Anti-bureaucratic, bombard the headquarters as the slogan went, somewhat anarchic, his idea of continuous revolution and the claim that class struggles will continue under socialism and even under communism, there will be contradictions, and so on. Even Mao's military writings were fascinating, for the emphasis there, quite remarkably, was on winning over enemies rather than destroying them, isolating only the most unrepentant of them. What I did not understand then, but do so now, and this is one of the key arguments in this respect, is that all these positions of Mao came from a different understanding of dialectics and of contradictions from the Hegelian one that we have become used to believing as dialectic itself. So I refer there to the way in which Taoist dialectics actually, in a way, became very central to the way in which Mao thinks about dialectics and contradictions and the relations between different contradictions. What I did not understand then, but do so now, is also the fact that much of Marxism's understanding of communism as the idyllic classless society was the secular analog of the Judeo-Christian notion of eternity, which is always counterposed to the notion of historical time, of this worldly strife. In stark contrast to this, Mao's insistence on the impermanence of contradiction and conflict drew from various Eastern notions of time as itself without beginning and end. So this is different from eternity, where there is no change, there is no conflict, there is no change, you don't grow old, you don't die, etc., and so on. But the notion of time itself as being without beginning and end, and as the cause of strife and sorrow. Here, quite remarkably, Taoist, Buddhist, and Hindu notions of time seem to share quite a lot. And the second point that I want to raise today is that talking of border Marxisms and non-Western Marxism today is emphatically not and cannot be only about the past. It's not an exercise in intellectual history. It's not an exercise of what earlier Western Marxists did or did not do, but has to equally be about the future. It is not simply that we are underdeveloped and backward and our only destiny has to be to follow the straight linear path that was laid out by the trajectory of Western modernity, which is why in chapter 5, I talk of stepping outside or exiting the linear time of historical materialism. For very long, our fate has been discussed in terms of the distinction between formal subsumption and real subsumption of labor under capital. Real subsumption is obviously the real thing, and formal subsumption is, to borrow Dipesh Chakravarti's felicitous expression, only the waiting room of history where we must remain till capital fully embraces us and we are fully subsumed. The point that I want to make here is twofold. In the era of climate change, when all forms of life on Earth are threatened by capital, does it even matter whether we are formally subsumed or really? This is not a trivial rhetorical question, but is also linked to the other key claim I make in the book, that capital-labor contradiction was characteristic of one historical moment, and that today the primary challenge to capital, the most determined struggles against it, comes from indigenous people and peasantry, struggles around land, forests, biodiversity, and agribusinesses, and against agribusinesses are all now situated in the global south. That is why, from the emergence of an international peasant movement for the first time, that is La Via Campesina, to the revolt in the Chiapas Mountains, to the rise of new left formations in Latin America, it is the indigenous people and peasantry who are fighting in the front lines. The recent year-long farmer struggle in India too is an instance of this change, where Adivasis or indigenous people have been actually fighting the most determined battles against corporate takeover of their lands and forests for decades now. This is an issue I discuss at length in chapter 3, which I call Peasantry and the Marxist Unconscious, an issue that resonates with Frantz Fanon's claim made decades ago that in colonized Africa, the peasantry is the only revolutionary class as it lies outside the colonial system. This also ties up very well with the concerns of the late Marx around questions of pre-capitalist common property and possibility of bypassing capitalism altogether. B, this brings me to the second aspect of the question, which has to do with the fact that contrary to Marxist expectations, not only has capitalism not developed in about 3/4 of the world, despite more than 3 centuries of determined state-led efforts to do so, today we are acutely aware that large populations of the world have become redundant for capitalism. In chapter 2, I use the analogy of the expressways of capital, which connect the south to the north, which have practically no relationship to populations and lives lived beneath them. It is only the still colonized post-colonial southern state elites who believe that they have to keep running on those expressways to keep pace with the USA and Europe, a race they can never win. However, in the face of climate change, the realization has also dawned and that if we really want to replicate the Euro-American model, we might need at least 5 more Earths. The only option, and that is where our philosophical challenge lies, is to change the game, to not play their game anymore. It is worth reminding ourselves in this context that for the first time, a philosophical challenge has emerged, if only in a very rudimentary state, that has given rise to different kinds of critique of capitalism. Unlike earlier critiques that were merely political and economic in the manner of the 20th century socialism, we can see the emergence of a fundamental ontological critique that draws on indigenous cosmologies and relational philosophies from different parts of the world, which emphasize the interconnectedness of the universe. Newer scholarly and philosophical critiques of capitalism have also unpacked capital's and Western modernity's self-fulfilling autobiographical narratives, opening up real possibilities of imagining futures that take us altogether other routes by stepping outside the linear highway. And finally, the third issue that I want to raise is to take up briefly the one gestured to in the reference to Fanon earlier, but it comes out very strongly in Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism as well, which I engage with at length. This is the question of the outside of capitalism, but also of modernity. I have dealt with it in my earlier book in Decolonizing Theory, but here it comes up in Robinson's challenge to Marx and Marx's claim that capitalism and modernity are endogenous developments in Europe. What is important is that Robinson does not make a mere empirical claim about Atlantic slave trade and colonization, but in fact challenges the very theoretical edifice of a dialectics that sees change as internal to the totality as a consequence of the internal class struggle or conflict between productive forces and production relations. Robinson's argument against the assumed universality of capitalism is no less theoretically potent, as against the argument that capitalism dissolves all pre-modern identities to usher in a universal mode of being. Cedric Robinson argues that, on the contrary, capitalism became what it was because it was a product of pre-modern European culture. In other words, it was and could not but be culturally marked. This idea, racism being central to it, was not just accidental. So this idea that capitalism was something which emerged aculturally, kind of universal, unmarked by any cultural markers, and was destined to take the entire world and produce a universal identity, that is obviously rejected through Robinson's interrogations. So I'll just conclude now, therefore, by saying that my argument, in a sense, runs parallel to Robinson's, insofar as I claim that, in fact, all the colonial and post-colonial world needs to be seen as the outside, not just as outside in the beginning of capitalism's becoming, when Africa, slave trade, and so on, provided the preconditions in a way of capitalist growth, but in a way, all of capitalist history this part of the world remains outside, which capital seeks to capture through colonial conquests, but which always ever remain uncaptured and undisciplined. Indeed, even in most post-colonial societies, pre-capitalist sectors of the economy remain outside the sphere of capital. Though I discuss this question with respect to the most important work of Indian economist Kalyan Sanyal, I claim that as long as we see the global south as part of a single totality, where it is always in a relation of subordination and agency always rests with the West, we cannot even begin to theorize the agency of the global south. So as a precondition to that, I think it is necessary for us to first get out of the notion of the global economy or global capitalism as a totality with kind of a single homogeneous logic. It is in fact better seen as an apparatus of capture which tries to colonize different domains across the world, which are non-capitalist still. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nijam, for that. Lots of food for thought. So everyone in the virtual room, if you have questions, you can be formulating your ideas and putting them in the Q&A box, and we'll engage with those questions later on when we do the Q&A. So if your questions are there, you can put them in the Q&A, and don't forget to also be specific about who you're addressing your questions to. Up next, we have Dr. Musab Yunus, who is a writer and scholar of international and political thought, whose work explores race, imperial history, and anti-colonialism. He's a senior lecturer at Queen's Mary University of London and the author of On the Scale of the World, The Formation of Black Anti-Colonial Thought. The floor is yours, Dr. Yunus.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scott, and thanks to Suren Pillay and Pindi Malaza and everyone else involved in organizing this event. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. So I'm going to talk about West African anti-colonial economic thought during the 1920s and 30s. And what I'm going to say is based upon the second chapter of my book, On the Scale of the World, which was published by the University of California Press late last year. Now, students of the history of economic thought notice that West Africa is pretty much absent from those histories. Surveys of economic thought, when discussing a concept like African structuralism, locate it as an importation from Latin America during the 1960s and 70s. But what I try and show in that chapter, and what I'm going to talk about today, is that half a century before, in books and especially newspapers published across West Africa during the interwar period, a distinctive economic understanding of the world took shape. And this was an understanding which saw Africa, and especially West Africa, in terms of enforced immobility. Africa suffered from the akinetic position it had been assigned in the world economy. And I suggest that this was a radical way of thinking about imperialism and the world in which imperialism operated. It was an image of the world as hierarchical in racial terms, structurally underprivileging African and other colonized peoples. And while this image of the world was, of course, open to outside ideas, it wasn't a kind of hermetic West African tradition, neither was it simply derived from outside ideas. West Africans and others across the Black Atlantic, of course, didn't invent the idea of a world structured by exploitation. As far back as 1764, the philosopher Herder had recognized that, quote, the delicacies of our tables are a product of the pillage of distant worlds. And Marx's concept of primitive accumulation famously linked the birth of capitalism in Europe to the violence of enslavement and genocide in Africa and the Americas. But if what we might call global structuralism had a long history, its Black Atlantic and specifically West African articulation was, as I'll try to explain, original in many ways. And I think that this also connects quite nicely to what Professor Nijam was saying because I see this as also some of the kind of backdrop and precursor to the kind of work that Cedric Robinson and others did. So I want to begin with the 1920s. The first figure I want to talk about is very well known, J.E. Casely Hayford. As many of you will know, he was a lawyer from colonial Ghana and the editor of the Gold Coast Leader between 1919 and 1930. Casely Hayford was a luminary of West African interwar politics. He was active in organizations like the Aborigines Rights Protection Society and the National Congress of British West Africa. The timing of his career, predominantly, in the 1920s and earlier, means that he's often understood retrospectively in terms of a kind of nationalist teleology, an important figure, but someone who was superseded following his death in 1930 by the more properly nationalist politicians of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. In particular, later Marxist interpretations of Casely Hayford have tended to see him as part of colonial Ghana's, quote, coastal petty bourgeoisie, whose politics represented the position of this intermediary elite group. And what I think is missing from these accounts, this idea of Casely Hayford as both insufficiently nationalist and overly bourgeois, is an actual reading of the collection of articles that he curated as editor of the Gold Coast Leader in the 1920s. This is an archive which, if you go and read it, is full of very rich descriptions of colonialism's exploitative nature. As far back as 1903, Casely Hayford had written that, quote, time and again the native does the hard work and the European draws the hard cash, end quote. 5 years later, E.W. Blyden, of course, a major influence on Casely Hayford, had identified Africans' inability to generate wealth under colonialism as a systemic property of the colonial order. The statement that Blyden made to this effect in 1908 is, I think, a very important moment in West African structural economic thinking. So I'm just going to quote now. Not one civilized native, wrote Blyden, who 50 years ago was, for this country, independently rich in the European sense, has left any descendant who is not today living from hand to mouth. All their wealth, sooner or later, goes back to the European, in spite of the most stringent provisions of wills and codicils. Men may doubt this, object to it, hate it, and think that their case will be an exception to the rule, but the law goes on all the same. It is not a rule, but a law, the law of disintegration under the European competitive order, end quote. Okay, so already here in Casely Hayford and Blyden's writing from the early 1900s, we see an economic critique of colonialism that is not limited to one or another European empire, but identifies, in generalizing theoretical terms, a problematic and destructive relationship between the European and the non-European within a global imperial system. And I think Blyden's phrase, the law of disintegration, is particularly interesting when we think about later articulations of structuralism and dependency. Casely Hayford's elaboration in the Gold Coast Leader and in other places of Blyden's economic critique of colonialism shows how such a critique can be premised on the struggles of an elite struggling to retain its wealth, but can develop into a broader structural view of the colonial relationship, a view that is not simply restricted to that elite. And so I think it's quite important that under Casely Hayford's editorship in the 1920s, the Gold Coast Leader did a couple of things to advance this economic critique of colonialism. One of the things was that they stressed the importance of racial ideology in West Africa's economic troubles. Here, I think we come to one of the kind of prefigurations of Robinson. And they compared West Africa's present suffering under colonialism to its previous suffering under enslavement. Quote, the dominant powers of this world are interested in keeping the African in his place, end quote. The Gold Coast Leader also put forward a critical analysis of the doctrine of indirect rule, one of Casely Hayford's primary political campaigns, which of course was unsuccessful. Indirect rule did come into effect. And in the criticisms of indirect rule that you read in the Gold Coast Leader, we see a series of differences being outlined between those who are identified as natives and non-natives within the British Empire, and particularly the differential treatment of white races and colored races, to use the terms used by the Gold Coast leader. A 1926 editorial, for example, protested the domination of, quote, the European empire stock, end quote, which sought to, quote, monopolize the economic and industrial position in the dominions and also in the dependencies, and threatened to transform the owners of the soil to mere wage earners. Okay, so that's the 1920s. I want to move on to talking about some West African writing now during the 30s. As you know, the 30s was a very difficult economic period for the region. Its economic crisis was, of course, linked to the Great Depression, but it took a particular form in West Africa due to the region's primary commodity export-dependent economy, which suffered a great deal during the global crisis. Prices for West African crops dropped by 60 to 70%. As a result, familiar story, new taxes were instituted by the colonial administration and new austerity measures were implemented. These sought to transfer the costs of the depression onto the West African population. As a result, we saw strikes, demonstrations, riots, and protests spreading across the region. Now, I think what's interesting, if you go and read West African newspapers being published at that time, West African critics of colonial policy argued that the British Empire was taking measures to shield the metropole, London, from colonial responsibility in a way that contrasted with the favorable treatment received by white dominions. In a typical analysis, the West African pilot in 1938 explained that European merchants were, quote, not commercially moral. They depended on African produce, but sold goods to Africans at utterly inflated prices. In the process, they, quote, insist on skinning us to the bone in order to declare dividends for their heartless shareholders. All of this, the newspaper argued, was assisted by the unfair lending practices of banks, who ruthlessly exploited, quote, the owners of our land, the Africans. This view of West Africa's economic crisis located that crisis within a global economy that had made Africans, as Kofi Peki put it in 1938 in the African Morning Post, quote, solely contingent. And I think the word contingent here is interestingly prefigurative of the idea of dependency. One big event in West African, particularly colonial Ghanaian politics during the 1930s was a series of cocoa holdups, essentially a series of sellers' strikes where cocoa producers refused to sell their cocoa at the artificially lowered prices. And I think if you, again, look at how that dispute was described and explained in West African newspapers, it was seen not simply as a dispute between producers and buyers within a market, and not even a dispute within a specific imperial economy, but a question of explicitly racist exploitation of Africans. And the lessons of that exploitation were clear, as Jusei Muhammad Ali wrote in the Lagos-based Comet in 1935, quote, no colonial acquisition has ever been attempted solely in the interest of the people. Such acquisition has always been undertaken in the economic interest of the colonizers. There have been no moral considerations whatever. As someone else put it in another newspaper around the same time, the white man came for our goods and not for our good. So I want to finish by saying a few words about what I think is the importance of this West African archive of economic thought. One of the things I argue in the book when kind of reading this work is that I think an undue emphasis on formalized theory, as well as a restrictive view of the Marxist tradition, have together left us with a radically incomplete picture of the history of thinking about exploitation on a global scale. Surveys of dependency and world systems theory, for example, have presented ideas about unequal exchange and dependency as being transported to Africa from Latin America during the late 60s and 70s, they do not mention that traditions of understanding African economies in world perspective already existed on the continent before the Second World War. Histories of economic thought omit Africa and the Black Atlantic entirely, while studies of West African nationalism, very valuable and contain a lot of important information, are nevertheless overwhelmingly concerned with political as opposed to economic thinking. So I think that a gap emerges where the very important and serious history of economic thought in West Africa, and I think this goes for many other colonial contexts, is essentially written out of the history of political and economic thought. Now, I've used the word structuralist a few times, and I think that this West African writing that I've talked about can be characterized as structuralist in approach. In that sense, of course, it had similarities with the perspective of the Communist International. We're here today talking about Western, non-Western Marxisms. That similarity is not coincidental. We might think here of George Padmore, a Comintern official until 1934, Pan-African militant and professional anti-colonial revolutionary, whose influence is evident in West African newspapers from at least 1931. But what I think distinguished West African structuralism from its Comintern counterpart was a West African emphasis on the affinities, specifically the racial affinities that lay behind exploitation, rather than the self-propelling and systemic nature of that exploitation. West African intellectuals highlighted the racial chauvinism of imperialism, what Kobina Setchi had called in 1922, quote, the spirit of group morality amongst our white friends. A vision of the world divided by race helped to achieve what the geographer Neil Smith later calls the abrogation of boundaries. And what I mean by that is it allowed intellectuals in British-occupied West Africa to refuse the imaginative boundaries imposed by the British imperial system, and also to identify divisions within that system between white and black, citizen and subjects. In many ways, I think their analysis was prescient. Historians have since shown that, for example, levels of economic investment in the British Empire radically diverged between what historian James Belich calls, quote, the Black Empire and the White Empire. This was a racial division within and constitutive of the British imperial system. But it also reflected a global order of which the British Empire was one constituent, a major constituent, but nevertheless one constituent. In a fitting phrase, the Ghanaian critic J.W. de Graaf Johnson described the situation that had resulted as a global disequilibrium in human destinies. And I think when we're thinking about the relevance of anti-colonial thought to today, we might think about the extent to which we still confront a disequilibrium in human destinies in the world today. So following the Second World War, okay, in some ways, as we know, the capaciousness of these understandings of political community narrowed. We start seeing country-specific nationalisms emerging in a way that hadn't been the case before. But what we also saw from March 57 until sometime in 1963 was a political project that tried vigorously to dissolve continental state boundaries with a view to Pan-African unification. The United States of Africa, led by Nkrumah's Ghana, was a project whose intellectual roots, though they stretched across the Black Atlantic, were embedded in West Africa's intellectual culture under British colonialism. This was a culture that encompassed economic as well as political and cultural thinking. And I think it operated on a radically expansive scale, seeking not only national or regional, but also planetary reconfiguration. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yunus. That was fantastic. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions that will come for that. So now we move to perhaps a more ethnographic, more lived reality kind of paper Dr. Asanda Benya will now present, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cape Town, whose work include gender, labor, and social movements, gender in extractive industries, human rights and social justice in mining communities. Dr. Benya is the co-editor of The Lives of Extraction, Identities, Communities, and the Politics of Place, and the Afterlives of Extraction. Take it away, Dr. Benya. You have about 15 to 20 minutes. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'm not sure if you can hear me, Luanto. I had
I can hear you. I can hear you, which probably
okay, perfect.
others
Okay,
can.
thanks so much for the invitation to the other Universals conveners, especially Suren, and also thanks to Pindi for organizing everything, and to you, Luanda, for joining. I want to talk about three things in relation to the topic that we've been asked to sort of share our work around today. And maybe just as a form of context, I am entering the conversation from a South African labor kind of background. So all that I'm going to be talking about focuses on South Africa and focuses mainly within the mining industry in South Africa, and really just a demonstration of the ways in which mining unions have been thinking about these things, what's been happening on that space. So there's three things I want to touch on. The first one is around union organizing in post-apartheid South Africa. I'll say it briefly, a couple of things about organizing in apartheid South Africa, but really what I want to focus on is that union organizing in post-apartheid South Africa in relation to non-Western Marxisms in South Africa. And I'm looking at this in particular. I want to zone in here on these trade unions that were taking up particular issues that weren't necessarily traditionally class issues, but often seen in the case of the unions I'll be looking at, who are operating within the mining industry, within the mining sector, but really as issues that were often seen as women and gender issues. The argument I'm making is that women mine workers who started working in the mines in the early 2000s have been forcing trade unions in South Africa and in mining, who have at particular moments embraced an orthodox Marxist way of thinking about exploitation or workplace issues. They've been forcing these unions to expand their terrain of operation to include gender and social reproduction issues because of the specificities of the local context. So I will try and merge a couple of papers. I hope, though, that in that merge, I can retain the coherence of the ideas and arguments in these papers in trying to illustrate what I'm talking about. The second thing I want to touch on is really social reproduction struggles that have been featuring in production struggles within the union terrain. And I'm going to focus on Marikana as a moment where unions, Marikana, for those who may not know the background, was in 2012, where we had a massacre in South Africa where over 34 mine workers were killed by the South African state. So I'm going to use this moment to demonstrate again as another moment where unions had to go beyond their terrain and spaces of organizing and respond or engage with or to social reproduction issues. The final thing I want to talk about is mainly from the paper I shared, which is around women's forms of resistance that have been introduced with their inclusion in mining. And I'd say I talk about them really as resistance that goes beyond your classical Marxist framework of thinking about resistance. And I think there's something to learn or to play or to think around in terms of strategies and tactics that these women are deploying when one thinks about these multiple Marxisms. So as a bit of background then on the first thing that I said, I want to talk about union organizing and non-Western Marxisms. When one goes back to history in South Africa, in South African unions and organizing workers, literature, I think, is replete with unions that have hardly, in the case of South Africa, ever really organized around workplace issues only or around class-based issues. What one finds in the history are these unions that have organized broadly around economic, social, and political issues, starting with early formation, early worker formations in the late 1800s, early 1900s, including the ICU that was such a big and militant union in the 1920s. What you see is that there has been the tradition of organizing unions that goes beyond just purely economic or class issues. At some instances, these unions have gone or even threatened really in some instances, unions in the case of South Africa have never really gone and have never really just focused on these workplace issues. But there have been instances in post-apartheid South Africa where some unions have tried to make a very strict distinction between workplace and other, so what they so-called other issues. Some post-apartheid unions, as a result, have managed to organize exclusively around these workplace issues, exploitation issues, so your typical industrial trade union issues. But the union I want to talk about is the National Union of Mine Workers and AMCU, which is another union that's organizing within the mining industry. Because of the conditions of their emergence, especially the National Union of Mine Workers, this union has never really only focused on wages only, or non-wage, or these workplace but non-wage issues only. What you see in the literature around the National Union of Mine Workers is this organizing around spaces of production, yes, they were their primary focus, but really going beyond your class questions and incorporating race issues in addition to the class questions. And this is because of the workers that they were organizing, workers who were not just exploited at the point of production, but also workers who were oppressed at the point of social reproduction or at the spaces outside of work. So therefore, unions adopted particular strategies and tactics that primarily focused on exploitation and race oppression, looking at one and not the other, that is adopting your classical Marxist lens and ignoring race in this case would not have worked because of the social and material conditions of workers that sort of necessitated this expansion. When you shift in post-apartheid, where women started working in the mines, you see that in addition to that class and race lens, which was already a departure from your classical Marxism, that lens was challenged. When women started working in the mines, which were spaces of super exploitation, what became as prominent was that they were also spaces of oppressive sexism. When it was only men working in these mines, this systemic subordination of women was less of an issue. In fact, it was absent or minimal. But with their entrance, women starting to work in the mines, gender, workers, women's issues had to be incorporated to and not dismissed. The interconnections then between race, class, gender were very salient. So this inclusion of women in mining introduced another layer of understanding of exploitation, but also another layer of thinking around oppression at work, which was not just about the economic exploitation and oppression, but also gender issues in masculine workplaces. Issues affecting women at these places, at these workplaces, in the mines in particular, differed significantly from those that affected men. Yes, there was exploitation, but gender oppression too. Yes, wages were low, but there was also harassment, there was also sexual exploitation, pregnancy issues. Some of these were ultimately pocketbook issues, but others were not. They were exclusively about women and their experiences in the workplace. These women's issues were not initially within the purview of the National Union of Mine Workers. They were not issues at all, in fact, because the workforce that they were organizing was exclusively male and had different concerns. All of a sudden, when women started working then in the mines, these issues became critical, of course, for a small section of the workforce. But what has been very clear and what has been articulated by women in these mining workplaces is that the masculine exclusivity of mines, it masked gender issues, the importance of gender issues. So the unions did not mobilize around them, but with their entrance, these issues that were masked for so long, they became very prominent. And when one goes and unpacks, and in the paper that I shared, I talk a little bit about the experiences of women that forced and necessitated that unions go beyond their traditional ways of thinking about organizing workers, both in terms of issues, but also in terms of the workers themselves, who were the workers. So what you see is that you have these women who are, as they enter the mines and become the third-class citizens in the mines, and also the second-class citizens within unions. You have women who are excluded, alienated, on the margins of teams, on the margins of work, because they were women in a masculine workplace, but also because there were Black women, there were no white women who are working in these spaces. So it became very clear then that race, gender, and class went hand in hand to sort of reinforce these peripheral positions of women. So continuing with only wages, with class exploitation issues only, and a few non-wage issues it was no longer tenable. As a result, we see a slight shift in the non-wage issues that were at the core of organizing for these trade unions. So sexual harassment at work becomes one of the issues that comes to the fore. Provisions for women come to the fore, especially in light of pregnancy, maternity leave, and so forth. So all of these had to be taken seriously, addressed by unions as they were mobilizing around wage issues. While this was an important step, this inclusion of gender issues within that mining union class framework, another process, that of social reproduction, was unfolding on another hand. What I want to underscore, though, here is that while the entry of women in these mines necessitated the broadening of the lens of struggles, all of these issues were still workplace issues. There were still production space issues. Of course, not all economic exploitation issues, not only alienation because one is a worker, but because one is a woman who's working in a masculine environment. So you see the prominence of class, but also you see the prominence of race and of gender. But I said another process began to unfold, and to illustrate this process that was unfolding, that pushed unions to rethink their strategies. In the case of what I want to talk about today is the Marikana moment, what began unfolding in 2012 after the Marikana massacre. So in 2012, you have workers who are killed in Marikana. And at this moment, we see another shift in union mobilizing and strategies adopted. But this union mainly is the second union, AMCU, not the traditional national union of mine workers. And these were somewhat parallel processes. So on one hand, you have the shifts as a result of women entering mines, entering masculine spaces. But on another hand, you have the shift because of the massacre. And this shift necessitates that they take seriously, unions take seriously spaces of reproduction and to respond to struggles there. So in a way, you have Marikana, a moment that has particular demands where workers are making particular wage-related demands, but not just wage demands, but living wage demands. You have Marikana making demands on unions. You have Marikana making demands that unions go beyond spaces of production, even if temporarily in their organizing. You have the moment in 2012 where they say that they are challenged, where workers are saying that their challenges are not necessarily only wage related, but living wages. At that moment, you see a serious reckoning within the unions and within AMCU in particular about communities, about households, about women, about labor sending areas. And this takes the union to the spaces of social reproduction, to social and political issues, not just economic issues. Workers are killed and union responds. It responds by pushing forward living wage demands and also by being very much involved and working closely with the community to respond to the massacre, to respond to non-workplace issues that are confronting workers because of their class position, working closely with widows, with families, with labor sending areas. And at this moment, the union begins to connect seriously and ask questions about informal settlements that are mushrooming around the mines, and links these questions that people are asking, that workers are asking, and links them to low wages. So in a way, it's not necessarily a new thing, but there's a new renewal of these connections, of bringing connections between the social, the political, and the economic issues. And the union responds by asking questions generally about, say, housing for workers, about families of workers, issues that are often seen as only important in the social reproduction space. So you have the union going to places like the Eastern Cape, where some of these workers come from. You have the union going to build homes for families of slain workers in places outside of South Africa. And they open trust accounts for children to have access to education, to assist with legal cases, demanding that the state pays for damages. In other words, the union goes beyond the workplace. It goes beyond the immediate living area of workers. It goes beyond only the living wage that workers were demanding. And it incorporates these non-economic, but also important social and political issues, not just within the workplace, but also within the social reproduction space. So a brief period, it operates like a social political movement union, as the ones we saw in the 1980s, where we had the social movement unionism. So you see at the moment of Marikana Massacre, or at the moment post the Marikana Massacre, a union that begins to rethink its strategy, a union that begins to say that actually economic or class questions alone are no longer enough if we are to address all of these struggles that people are faced with or are facing. So they move beyond the space of production to go to the spaces of reproduction. So at this moment, you have this convergence of struggles, of class struggles, but it's class struggles that are marked by race and gender dynamics. And these struggles, they go beyond the workplace to nearby communities, but also to faraway labor-sending areas. So this is a moment where the union really starts to rethink workplace issues and broadening those workplace issues that they were mobilizing around. The third thing I said I want to talk about is this resistance in response to the above, especially for women, response to their entrance in mining and the ways in which they are accepted, or the ways in which the space is opened up. What you see is that in response to the struggles that women were faced with as they entered the mines, is that you begin to see also new registers of resistance in mining, particularly emerging. Resistance that deploys not just the tools down strategy that workers in the mines have adopted, but you see resistance strategies that emerge, that begin to respond to exploitation, but also oppression, that deploy these different forms of refusals. And I think unions can benefit from thinking about these other things in which these other registers that women introduce as they come into mining and they have to respond to the conditions they find themselves in. At the center of exploitation of workers, especially within this context, is that it's not just workers, but it's workers that are gendered. It's workers that have bodies. So gender and body matters for capital in this context, but in what ways does it matter? In mining, capital mobilizes masculinity to get workers to be more productive. In mining, capital has disciplined men's bodies or bodies of workers. It has trained them to enable capital to extract as much as possible from workers, from natural resources. They've constructed these masculinities, these mining masculinities, alongside the lines of extreme risk-taking, bodily exertion to the point of death, tolerance of dangers, of heat and humidity, and so forth. So you have these bodies in a way being treated as expandable. And this has enabled mines to get away with dehumanization, with oppression of workers, but also with super exploitation of workers. So you have women entering these spaces and introducing different scripts of resistance, women refusing to be part of this mining masculinity or these mining identities that have been constructed in ways that allow and enable capital to extract as much as possible. You have women entering, rejecting the naturalization of mining masculinity, which enables the super exploitation of workers. And you have women who are employing at times bodily refusals, refusing to do mine work like men, refusing to do masculinity in order to do mine work. So you have these women who are entering these spaces, but also refusing to be in stopes, refusing to do work that they see as super exploitative work. So you have these refusals. And I talk about how these refusals, they chip away at and disrupt both patriarchy, but also they disrupt particular logics of work that have been naturalized. They also disrupt particular logics and incessant capitalist demands on workers, in a way attenuating super exploitation. Women's resistance and these tactics that they deploy, I talk about the ways in which they offer us actually a different and an expansive way of thinking about worker resistance. So you see them charting their own path, using these unorthodox scripts of resistance, introducing new registers of resistance at work. So they're able to do this. They are able to introduce these new scripts because of their marginality, but also because of their alien status. And just to conclude then, that the point of using these three things, one, traditional unions that have been forced for a very long time in the case of South Africa and in mining in particular, to really think about struggles beyond just class, to think and take seriously race at a particular moment, but also in the post-apartheid moment, forced to think and take seriously gender and to organize, taking all of those seriously, not just one and not the other. So I argue, so these three cases I'm trying to bring together. I'm doing this to really show that there's been some creativity deployed to respond to these struggles by unions, creativity that goes beyond the orthodox understandings of Marxism. That in the case of the traditional unions, you see that the approaches to workplace issues, that they're obviously inspired by Marxism, but on another hand, there's other influences of anti-capitalist traditions such as feminism and black radical thought that kind of emerges and influences the ways in which union mobilizes workers. So in search of where to for the working class or for the dwindling few who still have jobs, one sees a treatment of Marxism as a living tradition, as something that can be renewed, as something that can be reconstructed depending on social and material conditions of people. So this is not to say that these unions are progressive or women are doing everything oppressive, exploitative, but to say that these struggles are forcing unions and workers to rethink and to tap into other forms of resistance that are disruptive, maybe not always radical, but certainly disruptive and also militant in some instances. To be more, but also they're forcing unions and also workers to be more expansive and not narrow in their class and workplace politics, to go beyond class, to incorporate race and gender in their framework, in their strategies, and in their tactics, to consider really seriously, alongside responding to exploitation, to also address questions of sexism, heterosexism, and the overall system of subordination of women, and to reject the dominant logic of thinking about resistance, which are sometimes locked within the logic, the capitalist logic, the productivist framework, to know what that one can put pressure on capital, on surplus value, on profits by mobilizing also these spaces of social reproduction that aren't always neatly within, but are constantly in entanglement with the spaces of reproduction. Thanks, and back to you, Lwanda.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Pena, for that. So we have here 3 presentations thinking about Marxism from the Global South, to say non-Western Marxisms. The presentations are situated in different geographical locations, and some of the questions that have come through are also suggesting that we are all thinking from different corners of the world. So we will, if all the speakers can have their cameras on, and then we will try to engage some of the Q&A. And if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A. So we will try to take some of the questions in group form, because we were not going to be able to do each question one by one. Since I see that Professor Nijam has been answering some of the questions that have been posted on the Q&A. So maybe we will start there. We will start with, maybe we can consolidate some of those first initial questions. Here is a question from Rimal, a PhD candidate in the Department of History from Alberta in Canada, and says, I work on pre-modern South Asia using the Sanskrit language, especially on the history of the Ayurvedic medical system. If I understand correctly, you mentioned Mao's theory of contradiction-inspired Asian philosophies like Buddhism, Taoism, etc. I'm interested in knowing more about it. Could you elaborate? So maybe you could take that one, Professor Njamu, with the other questions that have come up there.
Yeah, actually, there are 2-3 questions around that particular issue of Mao and Taoist dialectics and so on, Taoist, Buddhist, and so on. So the point that I think this is something, of course, I've dealt with at some length in the book, but it's also something which I'm still thinking about and working on. And I think we don't have the time to go at length into a discussion of that question here. A couple of things at least can be marked out straight away, which is that there is a certain notion of dialectics that comes from Hegel, which is then taken over in Marx, and that's the kind of understanding we have about dialectics, in which it's linked to the idea of a totality, where the internal movement of a totality takes place through contradictions. So there are, not strictly the Hegelian terms, but the way in which a thesis is kind of superseded, sublated, or like cancelled and preserved at the same time by the antithesis into a higher synthesis and so on. This gives a certain kind of, if not linear, a spiral but progressive version of history. And there is a kind of inevitability of a resolution there. So every new contradiction then moves into a higher resolution. What we find in many of these, whether it is Buddhist dialectics or whether it is the kind of Taoist context from which Mao is drawing, I think it's not a long explanatory theory. Nor is it, as in Hegel and Marx, something which is embedded in reality, right? It is not something which is so. In Hegel, of course, the idea becomes part of the objective world. So in that sense, it is also objective world moves dialectically. So dialectic becomes something more than just a way of analyzing or looking, or as a philosophical stance. But what we see in this continuous references in Mao are the interesting ways in which he talks about one transforms into the other. Things transform into their opposite. The way in which a Taoist would talk about the yin in transforming into the yang and so on. So that when you look at many of these things, in fact, it's very, very interesting to me when I don't know Chinese, and obviously I don't have any first-hand familiarity with Taoist dialectics, but the little that I have read, I find it very fascinating that it's in a way more like the way a lot of queer theory develops, where basically the contradictions are not impermeable. The sexes, the male and the female, are not impermeable to poles, where there has to be some resolution or a supersession and so on. But in fact, the possibility of one changing into the other, the possibility of transformations through a whole range of other ways, these are always there, which is why Mao, even in his military writings, which I referred to, even in the military writings, what he's talking about is about winning over the enemy. It's only the most recalcitrant one that we will fight against or we will decimate. But the idea is not to destroy the enemy. The idea is to win over. Now, a lot of this actually comes from Francois Julien's work on propensity of things and so on. A whole lot of philosophical work which looks at Chinese war treatises from Sun Tzu down. All of them actually talk about war not as an act of destruction. Not you have to win the war, but how do you win the war? You don't win the war only by trying to frontally take on, but what you do is what he calls the propensity of things. You insert yourself in the flow of things. So you try and make the best use by not by acting outside, from outside with a plan, which is what we know military strategy, military theory to be all about. That you have a plan, you have a strategy, and you intervene. This is not the way ancient Chinese war thinkers like Sun Tzu talk about as per Francois Julien's thing. And that connects a lot with what we see of the way in which Mao talks about contradictions and principle and non-principle contradictions, and how suddenly the principle may not remain the principal contradiction, a secondary contradiction may become a principal contradiction, and so on. These are not possible within a Hegelian Marxist logic of dialectics. That was the point.
Thank you so much for that. I think we'll take questions now that are towards you, Dr. Benya. There's one question by Ravi, which I think is more of a comment, really, that yes, what happened with race and gender in Africa, something similar happened with caste in India, wherein mainstream Marxism ignored caste historically, though in recent years there is some acknowledgement of both caste and gender. There's more of a question from Arnaldo Asanda, the topic of space, the space of dialogue between the state and mining workers. Question, what was out of the state's control on negotiation with workers that the state was out of control or did not have conditions to satisfy the mining workers' problems in the context of the post-colonial period? And maybe one more question you can take with Dr. Benya. This is from Ruchi for Dr. Benya. You can say more about the distinction, but also relationship between refusal and resistance. Do you see them as the same yet different? It would be great to hear you speak more about that. It would also be helpful to hear you think about what political possibilities are contained in union work at this moment, given that a union like AMCU is being forced to deal with social reproduction and political issues, and what is impossible for them. Do you want to take those?
Yeah, sure. The first one, Arnaldo. I'm not sure if Arnaldo can just elaborate a little bit on their question. I'm trying to find it. What was out of the state's control and negotiating with workers that the state was out of control. Maybe if Arnaldo can just elaborate a little bit, that would be very helpful. But on Richard's question about my thinking around, and I suppose Richard read the paper that I didn't dwell very much on, about resistance and refusals, whether I think of these as two different or how I think about them. So in the paper, Ruchi, you would have seen that. So I think about refusals really as, when I think about the day-to-day ways in which women are negotiating what's happening at work, when I think about the ways in which women are not just responding to the day-to-day, but also really bringing in some of their experiences as women in a space that's very masculine, but also not just a space that's masculine, but a space that's super exploitative. So when I think about those day-to-day and the ways in which they're pushing back at the system and not necessarily even disrupting the system, sometimes challenging it, but at other times reinforcing it, when you think about the totality. So refusal for me is those day-to-day things that they are doing to push back, but to push back on the very specifics, not the whole system. And then the way I think about resistance really is much broader. So I think about resistance and I think about it in terms of the structure, think about it in terms of, so if they are doing A, B, C, D, in what ways does that shift power relations underground, or does that shift power relations at work? When I think about resistance, I also think about the whole the big stuff around sexism. I think about the ways in which we think about capitalism and pushing back on capitalism. So there's a relationship between the two. But I think when I think refusals, I'm thinking about the immediate. And when I think about resistance, I think about the ways in which that immediate, that day-to-day can build up and push back on the systemic stuff, not just the day-to-day, where if you're looking at the day-to-day, and this is what I'm trying to illustrate also through the paper, some of these refusals may seem contradictory, but I think when you add some of them up, you begin to see a picture where it's a real disruption maybe to the system, or there's a potential for it to be disruptive to the system. And then the second part to the question is about political possibilities that are contained when one goes beyond, or when a union like AMCU goes beyond spaces of social reproduction. What is impossible for them? I'm not sure about what's impossible for them, but how I'm thinking about it again here is that it seemed for me to be a really productive moment when they were thinking about these social reproduction issues, because they were tying things that I think in their struggles, or in struggles, union struggles, things that have not necessarily been tied together. So organizing and bringing in widows, for instance. And I saw that as a really productive moment in just also AMCU gaining more, not following per se, but AMCU having people actually think through union politics, people who aren't necessarily workers, because they were doing things that aren't only affecting workers, that don't only affect workers, things that affect people who are unemployed. So if you go to Marikana, the community where this union really started like growing, it started in other places, but it really grew in Marikana. And I think what you see when you go to Marikana is that people don't think of AMCU just as a union. They think of AMCU as a place, or as a space where they can actually make demands of the mine to respond to their community issues, right? Community issues that are produced by the mine, community issues that enable the mine to be as it is, to extract the value, to the surplus value that it extracts, not just from the workers, but also from the community generally. So I see it as having those kind of possibilities, merging these different struggles, workplace and I think also just nationally in the country, I think these are things we need to be thinking about, because a lot of the issues that we are confronted with, they move between production and reproduction spaces. And I think we need to be creative in thinking about merging these issues and pushing back and putting pressure on the state and on capital. What we've seen in the past few years is that by looking at silo, like looking at issues as just wage issues or as union issues, we've not really been able to push back. Instead, we are seeing the reinforcement of state power and of capital, and we see them coming together more than we are coming together to bring together and tie these issues. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. These set of questions are for you, Dr. Yunus. So the one is from Ruchi. How should we think about the so-called petty bourgeoisie concerns as they emerge in your work? Is this a group whose thought, if you will need to attend to more to grasping lineages of anti-colonial political and economic thinking? So that's the one question. And if you can then also take this question from Aaron, a question, it was great to hear your presentation and to read your fascinating book. I'm interested in your perspective on elisions in the writing of global Black intellectual history and political thought, particularly from the late 1890s through 1930s. This field is certainly growing rapidly, but I'm wondering, in your view, is there that there has been a tendency to minimize the importance and subtlety of ideas of some of the thinkers of this period, and a tendency to treat them more as merely an early stage prior to the more important anti-colonial thinkers, James, Padmore, Fanon, Jones, Nkrumah, etc., to come. This is from Aaron from Smith's College. You can go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you so much for those questions. And I think I can deal with them both together because they're quite linked. And just shout out to Aaron Kamugisha's book, Beyond Coloniality, which really actually informed my thinking as I was writing this one. So I really appreciate your question, Aaron. But yeah, I think that something has happened in the way that we look at the history of anti-colonial thought. You sometimes might also see this as the post-colonial canon, because it tends to be post-colonial theorists who are often interested in these kind of histories of thought, is that because of a general sense of disappointment in the post-colonial condition, in what happened, beyond the end of formal colonialism, and as we enter the era of what Nkrumah calls neocolonialism, there was a tendency that was quite prominent, I think, beginning in the 60s. But I mean, yeah, and I think you do see it in the work of people like Fanon and James, but I think it really continues into the 70s and 80s, is a kind of castigation of the writing of a lot of anti-colonial intellectuals who were active in the previous generation for their kind of class position and status, and for the fact that even though they claim to be articulating a kind of general view, a national or pan-national, racial, continental, pan-colonial politics, in fact, what they were really doing, was actually just articulating their own petit bourgeois position, what you might also call the idea of a comprador bourgeoisie. And it's completely, I think, understandable where that critique came from. And I think in many instances it's accurate. I think you also might think of subaltern studies in India, the Indian subcontinent, as having kind of done a similar thing with its critique of mainstream Indian nationalist historiography. But I think one of the things that emerges is actually this quite contradictory double standard, where Western Marxist thought is never reduced to the kind of status of the Marxist intellectual who developed it. We don't dismiss Marx because of his kind of bourgeois background, but we're very quick to dismiss West African intellectuals because of their bourgeois backgrounds. I don't think that's a very sophisticated way of really thinking about intellectual history. And I think that to kind of follow on from and kind of respond to Aaron's question, I do think that we need a much more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of the kind of intellectual, the thought, economic intellectual thought that we see across the Black Atlantic in the earlier period, particularly Aaron mentions, from the 1880s and 90s through to the 20s and 30s. We need to stop thinking in terms of a teleology and thinking about this kind of thought as simply paving the way for the thought of people like more important people who come later. But I also think that one of the things I try and do in the book is pay a lot of attention to the ways in which these intellectuals are developing their theories of the world. What they're doing is extremely textual in nature. We have all of these accounts of the offices of West African newspaper editors in the 20s and 30s being filled with newspapers, magazines, and books received from elsewhere in the world, sometimes illegally, because the colonial context was not a free one, and there were banned publications in many instances, but often drawing their picture of the world from this kind of interaction of what they were reading, which was often very hostile to their interests. So West African newspaper editors, for example, would read accounts in colonial magazines and newspapers about how Africa needed to be cleansed of the natives and made into a land for European settlers. And then they would use those accounts to develop their analysis of imperialism. So I think there we see quite an interesting set of practices to do with juxtaposition, bricolage, citation, repurposing. I use a phrase in the book that I get from Edward Said, that they develop a surreptitious counter-narrative of imperialism. And I do think that's really important. And I think that in their understandable but quite hasty desire to point out the problems with this generation of thinkers, we've sometimes missed some of the nuances of what they were doing and how they were coming up with their theory. So to go back to the first question, so-called petty bourgeois concerns, yes, maybe we might rethink that kind of reductionist language. There's more to say. I'm going to end it there, but I just want to say that one of the things I do in this chapter and in the book more generally, I try and show how Marxist thought of the period and Black Atlantic thought were in conversation in all of these interesting ways that you might not expect. And that's certainly the case for West Africa. There's a whole bunch of figures that I think you can look at, some of whom were directly connected to the Comintern, but others who were very engaged with what the Comintern was articulating, but also seeking to kind of negotiate that understanding of the world with how they saw imperialism and the kind of specific African, West African, Gold Coast Nigerian understanding of imperialism and capitalism. And I'm very interested, I think we should be interested in that kind of permeability and flexibility. I think that's very important.
Thank you for that. Perhaps we go back to Professor Nijam, and there were two questions that I thought could be interesting here. The one was part of the questions that were being asked by Richu, which had a connection between Dr. Benya's paper and Professor Nijam. Yes, the question is, there's so much to ask and think about, but it would be really great to hear about you talk about the idea of time, Professor Nijam, as it appears in Mao's thinking and its implications for political struggles today. Also, in the light of Asanda's presentation, can you also say more about your understandings of unions? So this is the one question, and I think maybe you could take that with the question from Joseph. Joseph is from the University of Ghana, Legon. The question is, what cannot be ignored is the development discourse and the neo-Marxist deliberations in industrialization, and with it, the unpalatable manifestations of climate change. Africa's development is stampeded by an increasing global and imperial phenomena resulting from Euro-American and Asia industrialist. Same Africans remains the least contributor to the factors leading to climate change, yet suffers its damaging consequences. In these increasing pervasive nature of geopolitical politics, in what practical ways can Africa and victims of climate change across the world demand global justice? It's quite a question there.
Yeah. So actually, sorry, which was the first one?
So the first one was about the unions and Mao's thinking about time.
Right. So, okay, so let me try and they're two slightly different questions, but let me try and come to them together. So one of the things that I'm trying to, of course, do is it's not just Mao's understanding of time, but in fact, I have my own take also partly coming out of how I understand the experience of the radical movement or the left movement in India, but also of politics across the global south. And I think the thing which ties up with some of Mao, but one of the things which is crucial is, and for our understanding of, including one of the questions which came up in Asanda's, was central in a way to Asanda's presentation, but also the question that Joseph asked, that this thing about coexistence of different so-called modes of production, right? So you have in India, if you look at it in terms of modes of production, you have a capitalist sector, a capitalist mode of production, and a pre-capitalist large sector in which you have formations of indigenous peoples which are based on common property. There are private landowning peasantry and so on. Now, these actually don't really belong to three different times, as one would have thought. One primitive communism, the other feudal or whatever, and then the capitalist. In fact, these exist simultaneously. And the challenge really is to theorize that. The challenge really is to how do we understand this coexistence? So for a long time, this was kind of understood as a question of the social formations, where eventually the capitalist logic will subsume everything. So we will move from formal subsumption to real subsumption. Everything will be ultimately overtaken by capitalism. That has neither happened and will not happen. All the evidence that we have shows that over the 20th century, in fact, in the last few decades, in particular, scholars have been talking about repeasantization. Scholars have been actually talking about how, and this happened from the time of Lenin, this whole thing about peasants doing part industrial labor's work, part peasantry. In India, you have the same tribal populations as well as landed peasantry and urban workers all circulating within. And they have different kinds of persona at different points of time. So coming to the question of unions, in fact, that was one of the points I mentioned in my thing as a young trade union organizer. One of the things that we noticed was that it was very natural for trade union organizers, when they were planning a strike, for example, to take into account the harvesting season and the sowing season, because that is the time most workers would go back. No strike could actually be planned at a time which would be a harvesting or a sowing season. So you had to actually choose your time also of an industrial action based on the agricultural rhythms of when the workers would need to go back to their villages to perform their agricultural work. So in that sense, these are not things we can discuss in terms of those very straitjacketed notions of modes of production and so on. I increasingly now think, and that is the argument I make in my book, that these are different forms of labor, different forms of exploitation of labor, but which are actually, there's no logic there of which is the dominant one, predominant one. As I said, capital labor was central at one point globally. Now you have actually a completely different shift. So these things are held together into a logic of coherence by political power, versus contingent formations of political power. These are not formations which have a purely economic logic which determines how they relate to each other, and which becomes dominant at one point of time and not dominant at another point of time. There's one question I quickly want to respond to. Martin Cortes from Buenos Aires had asked about the question of how can we from the global south move beyond simply talking about the particularity. So it in a way becomes a kind of division of labor where all the theorizing is happening in the West. And when we talk about non-Western Marxisms or border Marxism or global South and so on, we're actually only enumerating particularities or some such thing. So there I think I entirely agree with what you said. And in fact, my effort in this book has been to shift focus to questions of capitalism, to questions of capital, to questions of time, to questions of the outside of capital, and so on, to move the discussion away from the particularity of the non-West into interrogating the larger philosophical premises on, and therefore, trying to articulate a different philosophical stance. Whether I've succeeded or not is a different matter, but the point is, I think that seems to me to be the direction in which we all must push if we have to actually challenge this intellectual division of labor. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that.
There were many other questions in the chat box. I must apologize. I don't think we have the time to respond to all of them. So yes. I would take them with me. And I'll hope to get a chance to respond at some point, have a conversation with those who've asked the question.
Yes, thank you for that. There are lots of questions, and we kind of pick and choose as we kind of go along. There's a real method behind what we're doing. But I do want to go back to Dr. Benya, and I see that you attempted to answer the questions that I think it might be great for everyone else to engage with, or to hear you engage with them. So the one is from anonymous attendee. Anonymous says, the emphasis on intersectionality has led some Marxists to criticize it for being based on or being reliant on bourgeoisie identity politics. So lots of questions around the bourgeoisie. What are your thoughts on this? And then if you can, just after that, you can address Andrew's question, which is also for Dr. Benya. Thanks for the presentation. And an empirical question. Given the naturalization of bodily exploitation that men working on the mines have long been subjected to, why, in your assessment, did women in the labor sending areas appear to have been unaware of the extent to which their men were so subjected, and B, did they fail to encourage men to resist that bodily exploitation? In other words, why did they have to be present themselves to recognize and resist it? Okay. You can go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Londa. And I see that we've kind of run out of time, so I'm going to be very quick. And I've already answered these questions actually in the chat. The first one is, I've heard these critiques from Marxists about intersectionality being bourgeois politics, identity politics. When I think about the struggles of women, working class women, I don't think about them as bourgeois politics. I think about them as struggles of survival. And I see them as very much connected to whatever they are connected to class questions, right? They're not just bourgeois or identity politics. So I see the connections. In fact, when I think about what intersectionality, if the person wants to use that concept, what I see as important about it is this emphasis. I think for me, firstly, is that it helps us to connect dots that we don't often connect, at least in our work sometimes. And by illuminating not just the economic questions or economic conditions that people live in, but also by illuminating the totality of economic, social, political, and all of these other questions that are as important. And so I see that lens, or I see that expansive way of thinking about these, not as bourgeois, but as really a creative way of thinking about the character of oppression and exploitation. And then the second one is, because the question is what's to be done with all of these issues, what's to be done about these struggles, whether working class struggles, economic struggles, social struggles, and so forth. And I think when we think about these as connected rather than disconnected, or as some as more important and not as some as important instead, or some as rather all of them as equally important, I think it allows us to also think about solidarity that we can build and think about oppression, exploitation under capitalism, and think about how do we forge a unified movement of sorts. Whereas if we're thinking about them as silo issues, we don't really get to that thinking of solidarity beyond class questions. And then Marx sees questions around women in labor-sending areas. So Marx, I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, but I think about, we're talking about the context of dispossession here. contexts where people had no land, and questions of survival were very critical, as they continue to be, but I think in a slightly different way in post-apartheid South Africa. So I do think that those kind of questions weighed in heavily in people's minds, but also I think about the mining propaganda. I mean, when you go to the archive of the mines, in which the ways in which the mines painted mine work, what it means to work in the mines, how it's going to help alleviate poverty. But I'm also from the Eastern Cape, and I think about what I used to hear growing up about working in the mines. It kind of makes sense to me why women would not put pressure on their husbands to not work in the mines. But there's also something, though, when the last part of your question, because it speaks to the immediacy of there in Marikana. Why did they only get it when they were in Marikana? I think there's something about the immediate environment that helps to demonstrate just the depths of the exploitation or super exploitation in the case of Marikana. But there's also something about being close to the mines, where you are also in a way roped into the machinery of the mine. So you're not just interacting with the mine through the wage that's sent to you once a month. You are also roped into the machine on a day-to-day basis. I mean, one example I often make is that when I do my research in Marikana, people's times, going back to the question of time, people's times, how they structure their days, even when they're not working for the mines, they're totally determined by the rhythms of the mine. So the times that the police station opens is determined by the rhythm of the mine. The time that you wake up as a woman who's not working in the mines is determined by the shifts inside the mine. So there's something about the immediacy, the proximity of women to the mines and being there on a day-to-day basis. So not just the reproduction of the labor power from afar or the working class from afar, but that day-to-day reproduction of the labor power that makes, or that really illuminates or shows to women just how deep this super exploitation is. And I think that's one of the reasons you see them in Marikana being more involved than they were previously. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I think we're slowly moving towards the end. So maybe I want to ask our panelists, I think there might be one more question as for Dr. Yunus before we move on to closing. So what we'll do, we'll take this one question, and then with that, you can also share your closing remarks, Dr. Yunus, and then we'll move to Dr. Nijam, Professor Nijam, and then Dr. Benyao, you'll do your last closing remarks. Say about two minutes closing remarks each. So the question for you, Dr. Yunus, is elaborate on a bit more on how indirect rule figured in the critiques of the generation of West African scholars. In the writings you are studying, it is a moment when a divergence in the British colonial project is emerging between assimilation and colonial difference that would undo the demand for equality they are making. Do you?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Got that? Okay.
I think that indirect rule is a really important moment in lots of ways. I mean, when we think about later analysis of imperialism, the fact that in Mahmoud Mamdani's book, Citizen and Subject, it also plays such a big role, I think is not coincidental. There's also a similar process that happens in the French imperial system that I think we could also talk about in another context. That's to say that I think these imperialisms are all related. Now, the switch to indirect rule, I think is really significant because on the face of it, the way it's presented is actually giving more power to the natives, the term that was used at the time. It's pioneered, as we know, in northern Nigeria, and then it's spread out across West Africa and other parts of the empire. Now, the ostensible reason for indirect rule is to devolve power, but actually what it ends up doing, is what African critics of indirect rule point out, is that it simply shields the colonial metropole from responsibility from the expenses of the empire while continuing to exploit the resources of the empire, and particularly West Africa. Now, one of the people I mentioned, J.E. Casely Hayford, leads a very vigorous campaign against indirect rule. Another important person in this context is Kobina Sechi, who's an intellectual from colonial Ghana. Now, I think that if you read the arguments against indirect rule, they're very pertinent to thinking about today and to thinking about the politics of our contemporary kind of post-colonial moment, in particular because there's a kind of criticism of the ways in which a political system like indirect rule continues to operate on a global scale, but denies that scale in its official articulation. So it tells people that actually, if you are concerned about the impact of colonialism on you, well, you know, that's to do with your local politics, because colonialism is really only operating through and in agreement with your local customs and traditions. And I think that one of the things that intellectuals like Hayford, Casey Hayford, and Sechi do quite insistently is show that there is a larger scale on which this is taking place. And it's not helpful to pretend that really this is just a continuation of local customs and traditions. Sechi, you know, in a very acerbic set of articles and essays, points out in the 1920s that if the British had really been interested in developing local customs and traditions in West Africa, why had they spent the previous 5 decades going to war against local customs and traditions, going to war against indigenous peoples and chiefs and polities and kingships, etc. It seems curious, Sechi pointed out, that the British had suddenly gone from wanting to demolish all forms of sovereignty that they encountered in Africa to suddenly claiming to be the champions of African sovereignty. So I think that that's really important historically. I think that there's lots to say about indirect rule today. One of the things I try and suggest in the book is that forms of localist politics that we sometimes encounter today might be compared in a way to indirect rule in the kind of enforced provincialism that they try and impose upon subject peoples, exploited and dominated peoples. And I guess that would probably be the comment I would probably end on as well. So I know we're out of time. So I think it's about that question of scale. And I think one of the really important things about indirect rule is it reminds us of the importance of scale in the politics of both exploitation and liberation.
Thank you so much. Professor Nijam, closing remarks?
Well, I think one question which I couldn't possibly answer, it was too big to answer in a short while, which was about Africa, imperialism, and climate change, and how Africa can actually get out of it. But also ties up with other questions which came, which is there in the chat box, about how can we imagine the end of capitalism and so on and so forth, especially in the context in the way in which I laid out the scenario. Now, I think that my closing comment on this would be, this is of course a very big issue, but I think we have to stop thinking of the end of capitalism in some big revolutionary capture of state power all over the world. That is not obviously on the agenda. And what has happened with where you've captured state power, if you look at China, what's happening today, why do you have to go through the trouble of making a revolution if you have to still build capitalism of the worst kind? So the question therefore is that we probably have to think of it differently. Once we do away with the idea that there is something called the global totality of global capitalism within which we are trapped, I think that itself is a liberating. What we are trapped under is the political power of these Western European American states. But even that is not a space where you have no negotiating capacity. The other thing is that in the long run, I think what we really need to think about, and which is happening, I mean, it's not something I'm saying out of my, it's not out of my own head. The way in which new challenges have emerged and are emerging are actually going to make sure that if, for example, today we think of the huge profits that capital extracts from all over the world is basically unpaid ecological costs of over the last 3 centuries, and if it is to be made to pay, not only with retrospective effect, reparations for colonial damages as well as ecological damage, do you think that capital can actually continue to exist with its super profits and so on? It certainly can't. Now, the thing is, how do we, and this is something which is already on the table. It's not something which has to be started, but it obviously is something going to take time to gain the traction that it needs to. But I think the scenario of a transition of the end of capitalism is no longer the old kind of capture of state power model. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Dr. Benya, closing remarks.
Thanks, Luanda, and thanks to the other Universals conveners for the invitation. I suppose my closing remarks really is things that I've already sort of touched on, that capitalism and its mobilization of race and gender is something that needs to be taken seriously. And I think thinking about alternatives necessitates that one thinks about race, class, and gender. And I think something that is sort of an invitation, and I think a lot of Marxist scholars are doing, is to really think about Marxism as a living tradition, something that can be renewed and reconstructed. And I suppose the question is, what does that enable? Thinking constructively, hopefully, about the meanings of what it means if Marxism is a living tradition. What is clear, I think, from all of the presentation, and I suppose some of the questions also, is that the world is changing and there's a need for Marxism to also change to allow for all these other important lenses to be integrated into that Marxist framework. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for this. Perhaps, Professor Pillay, you would like to close us off and help me to thank everyone for sharing their work today. Thanks.
Let me thank all of you before Suren does the final thanks. Let me thank all of you. And unfortunately, in the course of the discussion, I couldn't get much to respond to, or I would have loved to have a discussion on the issues raised in Professor Yunus's presentation also. But anyway, thanks a lot for this great opportunity. It was a lot of fascinating questions came up.
Just to say thank you also to Luanda for chairing so fantastically and moderating the discussion, and Pindi for putting it together, and the team at UWC as well in the technical side, and to the presenters. It was a really fascinating discussion. We have so many questions, and we did have in mind that we will have this as a two-part engagement. So we are planning a second session on non-Western Marxisms, to which you will all be invited, and we can take up this as a conversation going forward. And again, just to thank you to Aditya and Dr. Yunus and Sanda for everything, and to all our colleagues in the other Universals Consortium and those of you that attended. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day or evening.
Bye. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.